Good afternoon, everyone. Please bear with us as we get this webinar started. We're going to let people filter in another 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll get going with the actual agenda for the day. If I can ask you to please self-mute during the presentation portions. And this is being recorded. So if you do not want to be on the recording, make sure to turn off your camera and mute yourself. And while we wait for people to filter in, please do take a moment to put your name, your organization, and if you feel comfortable doing so, your contact info in the chat. We will be trying to facilitate networking as we go through this implementation process. So if you want to be connected to other potential partners or grantees, please do put your information in the chat as we move through this webinar. Okay, once again, for those folks who are just filtering in now, please bear with us another minute or so as we let people enter the webinar. This is being recorded, so if you do not want to be on the recording, please self-mute yourself and please turn off your camera. And while we're waiting for more individuals to enter, please put your name, your organization, and your contact info, if you're comfortable with that, in the chat. We will be trying to facilitate networking with different partners throughout the process. Okay, we're going to start getting going now in a moment. I am going to ask once again, actually what I'm going to do during the presentation is I'm going to hit the mute all button. So as we go through the process during the general portions, I'm going to ask you to self-mute. We will have time at specific points in the agenda for you to ask questions. If you're comfortable doing so during those portions, feel free to unmute yourself and chime in, or simply put your questions into the chat and we will do our best to answer them. My goal is to get through this agenda as quickly as possible today, so that you have a good chunk of time at the end for questions and answers. So first off, I'm Edward Shea. I'm the Program Manager for Workforce Equity at MassCEC. My colleagues on the line as well, Camilla Bacalod. So if you have any questions, you can ask either of us. I have some of my other associates on the line as well. I think I saw Jesse Dustin come in, who handles our internships. So if you're interested in internships, feel free to send her a chat. Danny Heinrichs is our fellow, and Danny will be taking notes. And so you can also reach out to him as well via the chat if you need anything. So a quick look at the agenda today. We're going to go over the history of the funding to kind of give you some perspective about why we're funding the way we are. We're going to talk about who is eligible, both in terms of populations or locations, the various demographics. And then we'll take a break right there for the first Q&A section. And then after that, we'll move into the RFP proper. We'll talk about the selection criteria, what we're looking for from the MassCEC end. We'll be giving you some program examples and some structure examples. That way you can kind of think about whether what you're thinking of doing actually fits with this RFP. And even if it doesn't, you know, we're here to help and make sure that the clean energy sector grows. So you could still reach out to our staff and we might have some suggestions of where to go look for alternative funding, or perhaps even some of the other MassCEC internal teams have funding that would be more appropriate for you. So that's a very quick look at how we'll be going through the agenda today. So moving on, as I mentioned, the first section will be a discussion about how this monies came about. So back in 2021, the legislature approved earmark specifically for equity funding for workforce. in Massachusetts. There are some aggressive goals set in that act to increase clean energy in Massachusetts by 2050, and there's some interim goals. Some of the ones you may have heard of for 2030. And then the first act targeted specifically environmental justice neighborhoods and actually defined what that act viewed as an environmental justice neighborhood. So the map on the right is kind of a heat map of where all the various EJ neighborhoods are in Massachusetts. As well as EJ neighborhoods, they also were trying to support MWBEs, so minority and women-owned business enterprises that are trying to get into the clean energy sector, and also fossil fuel workers. So both current and former fossil fuel workers trying to transition as we move towards clean energy. More recently, in 2022, the legislator expanded that to also cover members of federally recognized and state acknowledged tribes, as well as members of populations currently underrepresented in the clean energy sector. And that sort of last one is big because that allows you to make the case, for example, we know that generally speaking, many of the clean energy occupations are dominated by older white male Caucasians. So if you have a population that is not within that realm, you might be able to make a case that they need support getting into the clean energy sector. So moving on to the next slide. So as I mentioned, those are the 4 categories that are being targeted by MassCEC due to this legislation and just generally to our own DEI goals. If you want to look more specifically at how the legislature defined an EJ neighborhood, you can scan that QR code or follow that bit.ly link. So throughout the presentation today, you'll see several call-out boxes. Right here, it's in the blue, where there's a bit.ly. So if you type that into your browser, it should take you straight to the definitions set forth by the Commonwealth. You can see sort of the breakdown there on the left: annual median household income not more than 65% of the statewide annual median, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to read those out to you today because you can link over to that page. But if you can't get to that page and you have trouble with the link or the QR code, feel free to reach out again to one of the MassCEC staff, and we can definitely provide you with the link. It is also defined within the RFP document itself. So if you download the RFP PDF from our website, you should be able to access these definitions and some of the other definitions as well. So moving on to the next slide. So in addition to specific target populations, MassCEC works within 4 specific targeted climate critical sectors. We look in transmission or net zero grid, which is solar and microgrids, which is the first picture. We also are working in high performance building retrofit, so trying to improve the energy efficiency of the buildings throughout the state. Offshore wind, which I'm sure you heard lots of news on, and transportation, which covers electric vehicles, the transition to electric vehicles, and all the related infrastructure. And here's another quick call out in the green. So if you actually download the RFP document, we define those different sectors on page 6. So moving on. So here are some quick examples of the occupations within those sectors. This is not comprehensive. You'll see on page 6 that we actually do list many more, which is not again, it's not only those that are listed in there, but those are prime examples. So we know that there will be a lot of electricians needed in the various clean energy sectors, not just the net zero grid. We also need them for EV installations. We need them in offshore wind and of course the high performance buildings. Pile drivers and other blue economy jobs are needed. Pile drivers is a very specific one, but then also you'll need general construction trade labor workers that are trained with the offshore wind safety training. EV technicians, as I mentioned, repairing the actual EV vehicles. From my own past experience, there will be sort of an increase as well of need of medium to heavy duty fleet vehicle EV techs as those sectors start to bring in more electric vehicles. The 2 I want to really call out though are the customer service representatives and the sales reps. So you wouldn't think of those necessarily being, clean energy sector specific, but you do need, clean energy knowledgeable individuals who can do sales, who can, for the retrofit companies, they have, customers that might be calling in with problems and that they need support. And so you'll need people that have the basic knowledge of those different sectors to be able to help. And the other reason I call it out is because it could be a good first stepping stone for some of the EJ neighborhoods that we're discussing, because some of these other ones, like electricians, you need to do a lot of training before you can actually get into the occupation. So while you're doing that training, you might need to stop that occupation to get to that point. So moving on to the next slide. So the implementation RFP itself. So if you haven't downloaded it yet, to the left, there's another bit.ly link that will get you straight to the page, and then the actual PDF is on that page. And the QR code will also get you there. But generally speaking, the RFP is $10 million total available for this particular round of solicitation. And each grant that we're planning to make can be up to 1.2 million across 2 or 3 years. And let me just point out that up to 1.2 million is, of course, the max. If you have a project that doesn't, necessitate asking for the full amount, you stand a better chance if you ask for what's realistic for your planned program. You may have a great idea that's not, a 3-year program, so, ask for 2 years. The big thing as well is we are hoping to see good partnerships come out of this. The reality is working with EJ neighborhoods and other marginalized communities is not an easy task. And so we're not asking that the lead applicant be the be all where, all, not to be the one to do everything, that they can bring in other partners that can help fill the various difficult gaps that we'll talk about later. So moving on to the next slide. So who is eligible to apply? And, I mentioned lead applicant and partnerships. We really do want partnerships. So page 7 of the RFP has a good listing of all the different types of orgs that are eligible to be the lead applicant. You can see the list on the top right. So CBOs, community-based organizations, educational institutions of many different types. So, colleges, universities, community colleges, voc tech schools, organizations running CTI programs, for-profit entities. So we do like when we see a employer step up and run a program, and we've seen some examples of that. Workforce development organizations, both for and nonprofit. So we have, we know of training organizations out there that aren't specifically working as a CBO or a nonprofit. And of course, mass hire workforce boards or career centers. They play a big role in the workforce system currently. So obviously we would love to leverage those networks throughout the system. Some last additional criteria: that lead applicant must have a Massachusetts-based office or staff. They must be in good standing with the Commonwealth, which, if you're able to produce a COGS, we would love to see that. It's actually, something we could potentially request, but we don't require you to attach to the RFP response. And of course, if you're a current grantee of MassCEC, we do welcome you to apply, but the program you apply for must be separate and distinct from the other programs you're currently being funded under at the moment. So with that, I think the next slide is the break for the Q&A. So if we can go to it. Oh, actually, sorry. One last slide before we get to the Q&A. So as I mentioned several times, lead applicant. Here's a very quick, brief, general look at what a partnership may look like. And this, we don't expect every partnership to have this combination of types of organizations, but this is just one type which we think would be a great type of network to see come in. So we could see, a social service geared CBO that works with the neighborhood on the boots on the ground level. They're already in the neighborhood doing recruiting, so they would be primed for that. They may already be doing social services to help overcome the obstacles that those EJ neighborhoods currently experience. And so because of that experience with social services, they could turn around at the tail end after placement and do the retention social support as well. And in many cases, those sort of organizations are already doing ESOL work as well. So they might partner with a career center who has further recruiting expertise in the broader scale, that have access to assessment tools such as the TABE tests or the ASVAB, which the military uses. And of course, that they may have connections with various employers already in the network. And they as well also have retention support. They may even have, for example, job readiness support and other programs like that. And then on the other end of the spectrum, the workforce development nonprofits might be able to come in with more very specific workforce system knowledge about how you train effectively, how you recruit effectively, and the placement. So the placement is a big, thing that has to happen as these pipelines go through. And sometimes that takes someone going out there and advocating regularly to the employers. And many workforce development nonprofits have that basic skill or capability because they have job developers on staff. And then community colleges, obviously a big part in this, or other higher educational institutions, they could provide the actual training curriculum, maybe this training space. Many of them offer ESOL as well. And in my own experience, many of them already have employer partners that they partner with regularly in the very specific sectors. And of course, employer partners, we can't forget them. They're big. They are the ones who need to be able to place. And I think many groups will see that's even more effective if you can bring the employer partners in from day one. They can help, provide curriculum advice. They can help provide level setting. They can come in and provide workshops to the students, because a lot of the times you lose students because they don't know what they're getting into. So they can play a great role in that. So now moving on to the Q&A, I believe. So I'll pause here and I will give some airtime. If you want to unmute yourself, feel free and chime in. So I see Alex raised his hand.
First of all, thank you so much for putting together this proposal. Really appreciate the work that you guys are doing. I'm with the University of Massachusetts Lowell Research Institute. And one of the questions we have is this program geared towards 2-year degrees and apprenticeship? Or does it also include electrical engineers, civil engineers, and mechanical engineers? Because we found for a lot of the work that we're trying to do, there's not necessarily the engineering workforce required to do the design work that would lead to these 2-year and apprenticeship programs. So are you hyper-focused on that sector, or engineers and 4-year degrees?
So when you look at the RFP, you'll see that we're open to making a case for a given occupation or pathway. So, we would definitely entertain that sort of proposal. I think the first thing that pops into my mind would be, would you be able to make the case that you're able to bring in the particular target populations we're looking for in a very specific way? Can you recruit from those populations and drive them into your pipeline to get to that goal that you're trying to get to? So if you're able to make that sort of connection there, then I could see that being a viable potential proposal. And before I forget, since this is you seem to have a detailed plan in mind already, I suggest for anyone, yourself, Alex, or anyone else, to come to our office hours. Well, we'll have more airtime to really kind of get into the weeds of what you're thinking about, and then discuss whether that makes sense in a grander scale. But I guess long story short, we're not hyper focused on trades or this or that. Like, we have a long list, whether it's customer service all the way up to engineering. So as long as you have a good plan in place.
Sure. And then the second question I have that I promise is relevant to everyone on this call is, the Department of Labor released a forecasted H-1B grant related to infrastructure jobs. Are you looking for applicants to take advantage of existing federal resources like that? Or are you looking for this proposal to be an entirely separate standalone program?
We love leverage funding. So if you have other sources of funding, I mean, we actually have a question in the RFP of how do you plan on sustaining this program beyond the term of our grants. So that is definitely a big part of what we're looking for. If you're able to connect it to your other successful programs, that's great.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Yep. So Mary, I think you have your hand up.
Yes. Hi. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Thank you. We have a grant from MassCEC under the offshore wind RFP that ends soon, and we've completed the training cycles that we proposed under that grant. So would we be eligible to apply for a grant under this RFP for future training cycles that would cover not only offshore wind, but the other clean energy sources that you had indicated at the beginning of the webinar.
Yeah, yes, you should be able to, so long as what you're applying for is distinct enough from what you were funded by the offshore wind team for. So if you're adding extra elements, additional occupations, or additional techniques, upskilling, various aspects that could bring something more to, what you're doing, then yes, we would entertain that. If it's exactly the same program, additional rounds, that would definitely be more difficult to justify.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So any other questions? I don't see any further questions in the chat. Anyone else want to raise their hand? Webinar? Okay, hearing none, let's move on to the next slide then. So selection criteria, page 11 of the RFP. So you can take a deeper look at it, after this webinar and come to the office hours and, ask us questions. So what we're looking for, generally speaking, we're looking for a partnership where not necessarily one partner, but the partners as a whole bring a good track record of working with the target population, working in the workforce world, setting up programs, and that network of partners clearly define who's doing what so that there's some clarity in the pipeline. Obviously, we went over in depth the target occupations of populations. So, obviously, if you come in trying to propose occupational population not covered by what we're trying to work in, with the areas we're trying to work in, it would be difficult to give you a funding under that. Program design. We do want a fairly comprehensive plan where it has everything from the technical training to wraparound support services, placement, access to credentials, having some proven models or using proven models, not necessarily that you've delivered in the past, but, taking examples from other programs that have proven success. We've seen a lot of success, for example, in New York. So that program design will go into in more depth in subsequent slides, but generally speaking, we're looking for a fairly holistic model here. Job placement, again, that's pretty key. We need you to come in with at least 2 dedicated employers. So we are looking for 2 MOUs or 2 letters of support. But it's even better if the employer is engaged through the curriculum development, through the delivery of the curriculum, so on and so forth. Outcomes and budgets, obviously those are all, proposed. But we do want to take a look at it and make sure everything is reasonable. One thing to call out, we will be looking at the per participant cost, but that we are much more cognizant that this is a growing field with a lot of, higher tech related skills. So we recognize that the per participant cost may be more than what you'd be expecting in something like a WIOA grant or a Commonwealth Corp grant. So if you're coming in with a high, per participant cost, it may not, kill the chances of you getting funding. You just have to be able to justify, that you need certain, items to do the training. You have higher support costs because you're working with a difficult population, so on and so forth. And then diversity approaches. So this is where, we're looking for various uniqueness. So maybe you're coming in with a partnership where many of your partners are minority women-owned business enterprises that are turning around doing training. Diversity of who you're targeting. So we've mentioned the 4 targeted populations that we work with, but we also are, excited to work with, for example, returning citizens or disconnected youth, or other categories of populations that are, marginalized and that we know need help and assistance getting into the clean energy sector. And of course, if you come up with a different approach to doing all this training, we definitely want to hear that. I was active in, for example, the Project Catapult Next Generation training, where employer partners did a high level of funding and interactivity throughout the process. So if you come in with something like that, that could be very interesting to our scoring team. So moving on to the next slide. So I just mentioned all the different sort of scoring criteria, but I want to make sure that everyone's aware that even if you don't fit within those specific scoring criteria, we may be interested still in your program. As long as your program helps us meet our clean energy workforce goals put forth in that that legislation and and our DEI goals, we'd be very interested in seeing what you have to propose. So on the left, that's just generally supposed to be like a career pathway. So one thing I've seen in my own work in the past is that there's certain employers out there who are mapping out career pathways, and they're very transparent. Right now, we're hearing a lot that the clean energy sector career pathways are not that apparent to the common layman. So if you come in and map out all the pathways for in the left is an example of the high performance retrofit sector, and that's not fully comprehensive. It's just meant to be an example. That's something that could be part of a program that we'd be interested in. So if you want to discuss your concept and you don't think it fits the criteria, again, you can come to the office hours. You can email us at workforce@masscec.com to ask your question and or request potentially a meeting. So those are different ways you can see if you don't feel like you fit the way the RFP is written, you can definitely reach out to our staff and see if you can find a way of fitting, or if we have suggestions of you going to potentially another internal funding source or an external funding source. So next slide. So kind of jumping back to the selection criteria, this is an example of a fairly traditional workforce pipeline. So in the blue, the larger blue arrow, you see the outreach and recruitment, intake and assessment. And that's obviously the front of the pipeline. But I want to say here that it's very important to think hard about how you do these, because obviously we're trying to reach populations that aren't being reached right now. So whether that's going through novel mass media approaches, I had in the past coordinators that would actually go out and ride their bike to every gas station in the Somerville area to recruit, for example. So thinking about how do you really reach that population, and then how do you make sure that you're level setting with that population so they know what they're getting into. Well, some of the feedback we've been getting already in some of our existing programs is that a participant will come in and then they don't know what they're getting into, because they think, generally speaking, oh great, this is a way of getting a leg up. I can earn this much money after I graduate the training and get placed. And they go through, for example, their weatherization training. But then day one, they get on the job and they get into the attic and it's hot. It's really, really hot in those attics during certain times of year. So then that they didn't realize that. So they turn around and they quit pretty quick. So we want to make sure that as participants they come in, they realize what they're getting into, which increases their chances of long-term success. And then of course they go into the training, but the technical training may also include job readiness. We're hearing a lot of feedback that we send out a recruit that's been trained, they go to an employer, and the employer says this person doesn't know how to be responsible in the job. They don't have time management skills. They don't know how to communicate. Those sort of things are important too. And then once someone's placed, obviously we would like to see them continue in the field and not just be like a flash in the pan where they work for 6 months to a year and then they're out of the clean energy sector. So that's where retention comes in. So during the entire process, the orange bar, the wraparound support services, EJ communities and other communities face significant obstacles, and we want to make sure that these programs address those obstacles as best as possible to make sure they continue to be retained in the sector. And then, as I mentioned several times already, employer engagement, the workforce world is pretty clear that, the best practice is to get employers engaged at various points and throughout the entire process, because that really helps, improve the process and also make sure that the people that the training programs are graduating are actually fit for the jobs and what those employers are looking for. So that's a traditional pipeline. So moving on. So I'm just going to give you a real world example that is only tangential to the clean energy sector. So I've alluded to several times now that I've worked in the workforce world on the other side of the aisle before I came to MassCEC, where I was at a CBO and running a medium heavy duty fleet vehicle and hybrid training program for techs. Primarily working with individuals from Roxbury and Dorchester, as well as returning citizens from the South Shore. So, difficult populations that face significant obstacles. And I had a great team. But before we even started, I worked for 3 months with employers to understand what they need in tech and what the bare minimum in terms of technical knowledge those techs would have to actually be employed. So even before starting the training pipeline, 3 months of research, 3 months of meetings. And then once the program actually started getting put on, into action, finding partners in the neighborhood who could help. So, we were working with the correctional system. We were working with groups that were specifically targeting, for example, Portuguese, Nepalese, Haitian communities throughout Rosendale. And those partners came on board, and we did some cost share with them. But on top of that, we also did significant mass marketing. We put out over $10,000 of MBTA ads just to make sure we reach as many people as possible. And it worked out because we ended up having over 300 recruits in a waiting list. Sadly, we could only take 24 for that round, but the point is you want to make sure you have people coming to the table so that you can then find the individuals who really fit the pipeline. So that was several different CBOs working together with an employer partner, and then we brought in MassCEC Community College. So we actually had a community college doing the training, and they also had significant employer partners. They were working with Caterpillar, various different big construction vehicle companies. And they worked with us to train and then also support the students and then turn around and place. So we did bring in job development help. We had a separate employment center that was doing job development. And then also MassHire was, collaborating with us and letting us know whenever an employer was looking for something. So the orange line, the CBO I was working at actually had significant wraparound support service centers. So we did all the support services, and it was constant. We were doing everything from providing food stamps, housing support. We even did immigration visa help. And that was all going on from day one and throughout the entire process. And it kept going on after. So one story, we had one graduate that came through a community college already with a automotive tech certificate, but he just couldn't keep a job. And so we worked with him throughout the entire process. We found out a lot of it had to do with his insecurity, working with, his brother, who was also having difficulty. So we worked through those social issues. And then at the tail end, he got offered a really great job where the employer was going to provide him housing and a free vehicle, but he turned it down. And the reason he turned it down was because he was still kind of dealing with the mental issues, the psychological issues. And so we continued to counsel him for a good, 3-6 months after that, before he finally got a placement. But that's the sort of work that, we had to dealing with communities who face significant obstacles. So moving on now. So how do you apply? The application process is pretty straightforward. We've referenced the RFP documents several times throughout here. Please make sure you grab them and read through them. You're already doing part of the orange box. You're attending the webinar. But again, we have several office hours coming up. So make sure you jump into one of those if you feel like you want to discuss your concept. Within the RFP website, there should be links to other informational resources, studies put out by Boston Foundation, studies put out by different groups, labor statistics. And then once you've gone through all the research, make sure to reach out to us again, whether it's via email at workforce@masscec.com or during the office hours, to discuss your concept and then begin your writing. So once you finish your application, everything is due March 20th of 2023, no later than 11:59 p.m. We've given you a lot of headroom here to start your writing. So unfortunately, we're not going to make any exceptions after 11:59 on March 20th of 2023. So make sure you get your application in to the workforce@masscec.com email on that date and time. And make sure you pay a lot of attention to the formatting requirements and word limits that are in the RFP, because we will be holding to those. So moving on now. So what must be included in your application packet, and this is covered on page 9 of the RFP. There's 4 different attachments that must be included. And the big one is the attachment 2, but we also will be looking at your budget milestones and deliverables. And again, earlier I referenced that we need MOUs and letters of support. So moving on. So I'm going to gloss over this real quick because the instructions are in the RFP. If you've applied to MassCEC grant before, you probably haven't seen us ask for fringe or indirect, but this being a workforce grant, we will be asking you to do so. So make sure you look at the yellow and orange boxes on your budget spreadsheet, make your calculations and make sure to update those. So we've put in placeholders for now. So moving on. So the dates that you should be aware of, we've gone over some of them already today. So you're at this first webinar. There's another webinar on January 19th, which will be somewhat of a repeat of this, but there may be unique questions asked during that application webinar. We have office hours. You can see the referenced here. Those are drop in, drop out. So you don't have to sign up for a certain time slot, but you do have to, the way the link is set up, you do have to pre-register. But once you register, the link will be the same for everyone, and you can drop in anytime during that hour on those dates. And again, the proposal is due by March 20th of 2023. So moving on. So you'll see in the application, we do ask you to set up your invoice schedule a certain way. We're not on a cost reimbursement type of schedule. We're on a deliver milestones and deliverables based schedule. And we like it to be chronological, but you'll see the instructions that explain that more in depth in the RFP. So moving on. So again, we want to hit you with these office hours. We want to make sure you come in and talk about your concept because we want this to be collaborative. And we want to make sure that we actually help form partnerships too. So come into the office hours, maybe you'll find another group that could be a great partner for you to work with. And again, if you don't have time to drop into one of those, or if you want to ask us a question directly, write the workforce@masscec.com email. So questions that come in via that email, we will be posting to the website. So going on. Q&A. So before we start the Q&A, make sure you drop your name and email and organization. And also if you want to, your focus sector into the chat if you're hoping to be, to take advantage of our networking and convening offerings. Okay, so turning now to the Q&A. So we have about 20 minutes. And so hopefully you guys have, the webinar today has triggered some thoughts. I see one question already in the chat, so I'll start with that. So Pete has asked, do you know if any planning grants are available for the application process? So, we do have the capacity to, if we see a application that's not quite ready for implementation, we have in the past turned around and made planning grant awards if we think the idea is strong. But on top of that, we will be announcing hopefully soon that starting in 2023 that we'll have rolling planning grants available. I don't yet have the exact date of when that will launch. We're just hoping early in 2023, so keep your eyes and ears peeled for that. So if you feel like you're not ready for an implementation grant based on what you see in the RFP, that will be a possibility. Okay, so I see another question from Alex. Are veterans considered community underrepresented in the clean energy workforce? So it's a kind of a yes and a no. So the veterans are decently represented in the workforce right now. However, it is a population that does face some obstacles. So the way you could kind of make sure that you qualify would be to be targeting veterans in one of the 4 targeted populations like the EJ neighborhoods, or current or past fossil fuel workers, returning federally recognized or state acknowledged tribes, for example. Any other questions? Feel free, don't be shy. Unmute yourself or type it into the chat bar. So I haven't seen anything come. Oh, can we get a link to the agent? So the neighborhood map is, so we will distribute these slides and that bit.ly earlier on, which I don't know if, Camilla, can you navigate back to that slide? That bit.ly will take you to a Massachusetts website, which has the definitions, but also a link to the map. And I believe that map is a GIS map. So it's actually interactive, so you can kind of look through the layers. Thanks, Janelle. So interesting question, Alex. So Alex asked in the chat, are you looking for MOUs from employers or will trade associations work? So I guess the short answer would be, I think trade associations will work so long as the agreement has some element of placement or leading towards placement, because that's the primary goal of those MOUs is to ensure that there's a job at the tail end. One feedback we've been getting from a lot of the communities we're trying to work with is it's really sort of gut-wrenching when you send a participant who has all of the best intentions through a training, and at the tail end of the training, there's no job waiting for them. And that just basically undermines the whole point of this process. So any other questions? I know many of you may just be starting to get into the RFP. So again, if you have questions that pop up after this webinar, there is another webinar coming up. And we also have many office hours coming up, and we're also available via the workforce@masscesc.com email. But don't miss your chance now. You can ask away right now. You've got us as your captive audience at this moment. Okay, so I'm not seeing any emails coming or any chats coming through, and I'm not seeing anyone raise their hand or unmuting themselves. So I'll do one final call, and I'll give you the count of 10. And if you don't have any questions at this moment, we will give you back some time in your day. So final call for questions, put it in the chat, unmute yourself, either way. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, thank you everyone for coming in again. We're here and available for you. We want to make sure this is a collaborative process, and we want to make sure everyone succeeds at this. So with that, feel free to write workforce@masscec.com, and we hope to see you at our future office hours. Thank you.